always go according to plan. And I'm sure that most of you are now aware that the presentation that was scheduled for today, of course, is not happening. Unfortunately, Kathy Gattenby has had to postpone her talk on growing up on Maria Island, but hopefully we'll get her back next year. But we have the very versatile and thought-provoking Mr. Neil Spark, who has very kindly accepted the offer to present to you. Now, Neil is known to most of you, I'm sure, and for anyone who may not have been to any of his presentations, Neil's career has been in journalism, publishing and marketing. He has degrees in politics, applied communication and public administration. He has a passion for history, in particular the development of democracy and early 20th century European history, especially that of Germany. And these themes are explored in a novel he has written that's based in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. Today he's going to continue the German theme with an amiable psychopath, how a leading Nazi beat the hangman. Please welcome Neil.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well that's good. Could someone leave the lady in the door? There's someone out there just wanting to get in. Thank you very much. We might leave the door open just in case people, there are some other latecomers. So welcome to the black hole. And look, today's subject matter is a long, long way from the peace and beauty of Maria Island. But I hope that you find it enlightening, interesting and entertaining. So, we're going to talk about Adolf Hitler's deputy, Hermann Goering. And he was described by a psychiatrist as an amiable psychopath. But he was far more than that. He was highly intelligent, charismatic, persuasive, and he used these skills to embarrass his captors at Nuremberg by denying them the opportunity of hanging him. We'll start by having a look at Goering's unusual childhood, his rise and fall in the Nazi Party, and we'll finish with how he cheated the hangman at Nuremberg. But before we get to that, this is John Emmerich Edward Dalberg Acton, better known as Lord Acton. He was an historian, politician and writer. You probably know the quote for which he is famous. In a letter to Bishop Mandel Creighton in 1887, he wrote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." The corruption of power in Germany, in Nazi Germany rather, began when President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. Hitler gradually amassed more power, and when Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler became the undisputed leader of Germany, accountable to no one. The fascist dictator's leadership style was called working towards the Führer, meaning those below him were expected to second-guess what he wanted. This gave his henchmen enormous latitude and unaccountable authority. Hitler once described Goering as cold as ice. But that's not the image Goering conveyed. He cultivated the persona of being one of the nicer Nazis. He was intelligent, charismatic and sociable. He had the common touch and often made jokes at his own expense. Hermann Goering was all those things, and he was a narcissist, a psychopath responsible for the deaths of millions of innocent people, including the millions of Jews murdered in the Holocaust. He was a signatory of the Nuremberg laws introduced in Germany in 1935 that restricted Jews' rights and excluded them from certain jobs and activities. And as we'll find out, worse. Now, a clue to how this complex character might have evolved might be in his childhood, which was unusual. This is his mother, Franziska Goering. Hermann Wilhelm Goering was born on the 12th of January 1893 in Rosenheim, Bavaria, into an upper-middle-class family. His mother, Franziska, reportedly predicted he will either be a great man or a great criminal. They are prescient words that show maybe mothers do always know best. His father, Heinrich, was 54 when Hermann was born. He had had 3 children from a previous marriage. Goering was the eldest of 2 children with Franziska. Heinrich was a former cavalry officer and a judge. He was a friend of the founder of modern Germany and its first chancellor, Otto Bismarck. Bismarck appointed Heinrich Goering Germany's top diplomat in southwest Africa, now Namibia, which was part of Germany's fledgling empire. Hermann Goering grew up in a castle, and perhaps this is where his pretensions to grandeur began. When Goering was born, his father was serving as consul general in Haiti, and his mother had returned home briefly to give birth. Then she left the 6-week-old baby with a friend in Bavaria and did not see him again for 3 years. We can only speculate about what effect the 3-year separation from his parents had on Goering. But we do know it would have had a profound effect as it happened at such a crucial developmental age when a baby bonds with his or her parents. But that's not the only thing that was unusual about Goering's childhood. Heinrich Goering, during his time in southwest Africa, met Hermann Eppenstein, a wealthy Jewish physician and businessman. They became friends, and Eppenstein became Hermann's godfather. When Hermann was born in 1893, Heinrich had retired from government service. His pension was the family's income. It seems they didn't have many other savings or investments. Eppenstein provided the family with a home in Berlin, and then a castle called Wildenstein near Nuremberg, which you just saw a moment ago. Eppenstein lived with them. He acquired the minor title of Ritter von Eppenstein for his service and donations to the crown. Heinrich was away from home a lot, and Franziska and Eppenstein became lovers and remained so for 15 years. We don't know if Heinrich deliberately kept away, aware of his wife and friend's relationship. And we don't know if Hermann knew, and if he did, what effect it had. We do know Heinrich was a distant and stern father. Goering's lifelong penchant for dressing up began in childhood, and like many German boys of his generation, he was interested in matters military from an early age. He played with toy soldiers and dressed up in a Boer uniform his father had given him. When he was 11, he was sent to boarding school. He hated it. The food was terrible and the discipline was harsh. He sold a violin to pay for his train ticket back home. He said he was ill and went to bed, where he stayed until he was told he didn't have to go back to boarding school. This is Dr. Gustav Gilbert, a psychologist who questioned Goering during the Nuremberg trials. Gilbert described Goering's childhood temperament as militant and aggressive. He dominated his peers, and if anyone doubted his authority and schoolyard leadership, his ready use of his fists settled any doubts on that score. While we're talking about his dominance, let's have a look at photos that I found interesting for their similar assertive poses. So here he is in 1907, aged 14. Note the hand on the hip. And here he is again at age 22. And in January 1918 and later that year. That later photo is side on, but we can still see the trademark hand on hip. So confidence and assertiveness were apparent when Goering was a teenager and young adult. That confidence and assertion was on show at school, from which he was expelled for arguing with teachers. His father thought the army would instill discipline, so off to an army cadet school young Herman went. He was accepted into the Prussian Military Academy in Berlin when he was 16. He graduated with distinction and joined the army in 1912. The next year, his mother fell out with Eppenstein. The family was forced to leave Wildenstein and moved to Munich. Goering's father died shortly afterwards. When the Great War began in August 1914, Goering was near the French border, but he was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis of the knees, a result of the damp trench warfare. While recovering, a friend, Bruno Loeser, persuaded him to transfer to what would become the German Air Force. Goering applied in 1916, but was rejected. Later that year, he flew as Loeser's observer, and in an early show of defiance of rules, Goering informally transferred himself. He was discovered and sentenced to 3 weeks confinement to barracks. By the time the punishment was to be imposed, though, Goering's association with Loeser had become official. Their reconnaissance and bombing missions were so successful, they were both awarded Germany's highest military honour, the Iron Cross First Class. Goering was given multiple awards, and during his war service he was wounded. He claimed to have shot down 22 Allied planes. On the 7th of July 1918, Goering took over leadership of the squadron of the famous Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, who had been killed in April. Like many German men of his generation, Hermann Goering was devastated by Germany's defeat. He agreed with the stab-in-the-back idea that Germany would have won the war had it not been for the politicians who were dominated by Jews and socialists. They had betrayed the brave men at the front. It was a lie. But like many lies, it gained popularity and many people believed it. And lies still have a lot of traction, as we see here recently. In October 1918, the Commander-in-Chief of the German troops, Paul von Hindenburg, who later became president, and his deputy, Erich Ludendorff, told the Kaiser Germany should seek peace. So if there was any betrayal, it was by these two, not politicians. A little aside, I think history has let this pair off lightly. They were a virtual dictatorship in Germany from 1916. They dominated behind the scenes the home front as well as the battlefront. They did more than anyone to cause Germany's defeat, the country's economic crisis, and the consequences of the Versailles Treaty. But that's a topic for another Kaleidoscope. Goering moved to Sweden in 1919, where he worked for an airline. He was often hired for private flights, and during the winter of 1920-21, he was hired by Count Erich von Rosen to fly him from his castle from Stockholm. Goering was invited to stay the night, and it was the night he met his future wife, the Count's sister-in-law, Baroness Karen von Kansthal. She had been estranged from her husband of 10 years, with whom she had an 8-year-old son. Goering was immediately infatuated. They married in Munich on the 3rd of February 1922, and their first home together was a hunting lodge in the Bavarian Alps, about 80 kilometres from Munich. Another significant thing happened that year of 1922. That's when Goering met Adolf Hitler. Goering had heard Hitler speaking at a public meeting and was captivated. He joined the Nazi Party straight away. Goering and Hitler were impressed with each other and could see their association would be mutually beneficial. For Hitler, Goering was a war hero whose upper middle class background gave the Nazis the respectability they lacked. Hitler was a way of getting the prestige and power Goering craved. Hitler later said, "I liked him. I made him the head of my SA. He is the only one of its heads that ran the SA properly. I gave him a dishevelled rabble. In a very short time, he had organised a division of 11,000 men." The SA, for those of you who may not know, was the Nazis' paramilitary wing, the stormtroopers. Goering was involved in the Nazis' failed coup attempt in Munich in November 1923. 4 police and 14 Nazis were killed. Top Nazis, including Hitler, were arrested. But Goering got away, albeit wounded. He had been shot twice in the legs. With the help of his wife, he was spirited away to Austria. He was in hospital for a month, where he was given morphine for pain relief, which began a lifelong addiction. I'm not sure how he got on when he was imprisoned in Nuremberg for the trials, but I imagine it would have been pretty unpleasant. The Munich authorities declared Goering a wanted man, which prevented his return to Germany. The Goerings were short of money and relied on Nazi sympathisers for financial support. They had sufficient funds to move to Venice, and in May 1924 they visited Rome, where they were received by the new fascist leader of Italy, Benito Mussolini. In 1925, Karen developed epilepsy and was diagnosed with having a weak heart. The couple's problems were worsened by Goering's morphine addiction. He was declared a certified dangerous drug addict and admitted to an asylum on the 1st of September 1925. He was a difficult patient. He became so violent he had to be put in a straitjacket. His psychiatrist thought Goering was sane and that his condition was caused solely by the morphine. The German authorities declared an amnesty for the Munich rebels in 1927 and the Goerings returned. He worked in the aircraft industry and resumed his involvement in Nazi politics. Karen died of heart failure in October 1931, and over the next 2 years, Goering played a major role in coaxing, exhorting and cajoling Germany's upper class to support Hitler's quest to become Chancellor, the equivalent of our Prime Minister. In the end, Hitler's appointment was less to do with Goering's efforts and much more to do with the scheming, manipulation and duplicity of President Hindenburg and his inner circle. Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor in January 1933, and in the first cabinet of 10, the Nazis had 3 portfolios. Hitler was the Chancellor, the Minister for Interior was Wilhelm Frick, and Minister without portfolio was Hermann Goering. It didn't take long for the Nazis, including Goering, to consolidate power. Now, some people think, there's a bit of a myth, that when the Nazis first started, they weren't too bad. They built lots of roads, they restored German pride and got Germany back on track. Well, that's not the case. It didn't take long for them to consolidate power, and on the 26th of April 1933, just 86 days after he was sworn in as a minister, Hermann Goering established the Gestapo. 86 days. The first concentration camp opened not long after. Like many things, the Nazis did not invent the secret police. That dubious honour belongs to a barrister by the name of Wilhelm Steiber, and he did that in 1848. Now, 1848 was a year of revolution throughout Europe, and the Prussian government feared a left-wing takeover. The government was convinced that strong repressive measures were necessary. Steiber, now an important and trusted figure in the police service, was put in charge of organising a system of agents, and that system endured until 1918. It included keeping tabs on 6 suspected left-wingers within Germany, and it had an overseas component. Steiber was disliked by the police and army because he was answerable to no one, except the Kaiser. Kaiser Wilhelm I was particularly interested in gossip and goings-on at court, and Steiber kept him reliably informed. The author, Philip C. Walton Kerr, in his book Gestapo, writes that by 1854, Steiber had organised secret police which covered all of Prussia so thoroughly that nobody was free of its activities. The amount spent on the secret police service included national and international activities in 1914, according to Walton Kerr, was, in today's Australian dollars, $169,000. The amount spent, after the war, the complex German spy network that Steiber had established all those years ago collapsed. But the new democratic Weimar government decided to retain the political police, which it named Department 1A. So the secret police were virtually resurrected with a different name. In 1928, and remember this is long before the Nazis, in 1928 the Prussian Minister of the Interior declared Department's 1A role was to observe, prevent and prosecute all offences of a political nature. By 1930 it had about 1,000 employees operating in each of the 44 administrative districts of Prussia. Most of its officers were drawn from the criminal police. So by 1933 there was already a strong secret police service led by an eager and willing officer in charge. He was Rudolf Diels, who was the head of Department 1A when the Nazis came to power. Goering was impressed with the bureaucrats' newfound commitment to Nazism and kept him on. Although Diels ordered the arrest of innocent people, imprisoned them, tortured them and murdered them, he survived the war and resumed his career in government in 1950. He was killed in a shooting accident in 1957. In a speech to the Prussian police officers in February 1933, and this is less than a month after coming into power, Goering said, "Every bullet that now exists in the barrel of a police pistol is my bullet. If you use it for killing, I am the killer. I assume all responsibility." Well, by the time Nuremberg came around, he didn't accept any responsibility for any of the Nazis' horrendous, horrific and heartbreaking crimes. Back in the early years of the Nazi government, he had many responsibilities. As well as running the Gestapo, he was the Minister-President of Prussia. An Australian equivalent would be the Premier of New South Wales. As you can see, Prussia covered about 2/3 of Germany, and it's where 2/3 of the population lived. So that's a fair amount of authority over a lot of people. Hitler also put Goering in charge of the Air Force. He was the creator and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, which played a critical part in the conquering of Western Europe in 1939-1940. But Goering did not want war. He argued against it because he knew Germany would lose, and if Germany lost, he would lose everything. But all that seemed unlikely at the end of 1940. The Germans had conquered at lightning speed most of Western Europe. You can see here. And this little yellow speck here, that's Switzerland. Speed, the drug methamphetamine, fueled the German troops. The invaders' strategy was called Blitzkrieg, Blitz War. The Luftwaffe would bomb the territory to be invaded, targeting the country's defence infrastructure and other important areas, and then the army would follow with their panzers, their big tanks. This is Reinhard Heydrich, I think the pronunciation is. He was one of the worst of the psychopathic Nazi criminals. In 1939, he was the director of the Gestapo. Goering ordered him to solve the Jewish problem by immigration and evacuation. Goering created an agency just for that purpose. In July 1941, Heydrich had risen to be the director of the Reich Security main office. Like, they love these bureaucratic names, didn't they? Goering gave another order to Heydrich: carry out all preparations with regard to a general solution of the Jewish question in those territories of Europe which are under German influence. In January 1942, Heydrich chaired a meeting of senior officials from state and party officers to a conference in this building in Wannsee, near Berlin. He revealed to them his plan for the final solution, which included Europe being combed from west to east for Jews. 11 million Jews would be rounded up and put to work in Eastern Europe, building roads and other infrastructure. Many, he said, would doubtless fall away through natural reduction. Those who did not were to be dealt with appropriately. Heydrich didn't say what appropriately meant. But according to one attendee, Adolf Eichmann, who played a key role in the management and transport of Jews to extermination camps, Heydrich's murderous intentions were obvious and understood. This is the Ruhr industrial region, a prime target for Allied bombers. In a speech to Luftwaffe pilots not long after the start of the war, Goering said, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr." He went further. "If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Goering. You may call me Mayer." By the way, Mayer is a common German Jewish surname. From the 5th of March to the 31st of July 1943, Allied bombers pounded the Ruhr. Germans called air raid sirens Mayer's trumpets, among numerous and other sarcastic references. The first Allied bombs dropped on Berlin on the 25th of August 1940, and they continued to fall. Some sources say Berlin was the most bombed city in history. The Battle of Britain, was a career-limiting moment for Hermann Goering. Hitler made the crucial war-changing decision to divert resources from attacking Britain to the Soviet Union. But he blamed Goering for not winning the Battle of Britain. In November 1942, Goering promised the Luftwaffe would deliver a minimum of 300 tonnes of supplies a day to trapped German soldiers in Stalingrad. Based on these assurances, Hitler ordered there be no retreat. The army and air force were to fight to the last man. Some airlifts got through, but supplies delivered were never more than 120 tonnes a day. The remnants of the 6th Army, who were at Stalingrad, 91,000 men out of an army of 285,000, surrendered in February 1943. Only 5,000 of them survived the Russian prisoner of war camps. Hitler lost confidence in Goering, and other senior Nazis laughed at him. From mid-1943, Goering retreated to his country estate, Karenhall, named after his first wife. And here he is with a lion cub. He had lions wandering around Karenhall. Visitors were quite alarmed when a large lion walked into a room, but there you go. He descended into a drug-induced fantasy land and lived as though there was no war. However, Hitler did not revoke the decree that named Goering his successor if he died or became incapacitated. The decree gave Goering full authority to act as Hitler's deputy if he died or became incapacitated. On the 22nd of April 1945, Hitler declared to his generals that the war was lost and he would suicide. Goering interpreted this as Hitler being incapacitated and sent a carefully worded telegram to him. A carefully worded telegram. The telegram was intercepted by Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, who convinced the dictator Goering wasn't seeking permission to act as deputy, but was a traitor trying to overthrow him. Hitler replied, rescinding the 1941 decree appointing him to his roles, and threatened Goering with execution for high treason unless he immediately resigned from all his offices, which he did. The extent of Goering's separation from reality is shown by his surrender to US troops on the 8th of May 1945. Would it be interesting to have been there to see their reaction? Because he wanted to have talks with the Allied commander, General Eisenhower, to suggest Germany join the Americans to fight the Russians. Oh yeah. He dressed for the meeting with US troops in full military regalia and expected to be treated as the emissary of a defeated people. He had 16 monogrammed suitcases and a hat box with him, emerald rings and diamond watches. But there was method in Goering's madness, as we will see later. Amongst the luggage was a jar of coffee, and buried in it was a cyanide tablet, which the authorities later found. They thought it was the only one. Goering was taken to a hotel where he had a lunch of chicken, peas and mashed potatoes with his captors. He later gave a press conference. General Eisenhower found out and ordered Goering that Goering be treated like any other Nazi captive, which was a lot better than how the Nazis treated their prisoners. Now that's interesting, isn't it? That he managed to persuade, convince, charm, whatever words you want to use, the troops who were arresting him. This was the man who was the second in command that these troops had been fighting for years. Goering was surprised to be sent to trial But he made the most of it, as he always did, trying to turn the challenge into an opportunity for himself. On the first day of hearings, the 21st of November 1945, he led the other 21 most senior Nazi defendants into the courtroom. Led them, as if this was some sort of conference or something, and he was his delegation. He pleaded not guilty along with the other defendants. He was charged with conspiracy and war crimes, crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. He denied all charges, pleaded not guilty. He became a confidant of several prison officials. To try and understand the motivation of men who perpetuated the most horrific and destructive war in human history, imposed state-sponsored terrorism and mass murder on an industrial scale. These men who were facing trial were interviewed and tested by mental health experts to try and understand how they could be responsible for these horrors. Well, IQ tests were popular at the time for measuring intelligence. Hermann Goering's result was 138. The average is 100. Two of the mental health experts who interviewed Goering became his confidants. The psychiatrist, Douglas Kelly, described Goering as a narcissistic and egocentrically fixated, but also having a normal, basic personality. He was impressed by Goering's devotion to his wife and child. Now we'll come back to Dr. Kelly shortly. His observation is echoed by Goering's descendants. His daughter, Edda, still doesn't accept the crimes and horror her father caused. In a 2019 interview, she told an author, "I loved him very much, and it was obvious how he loved me." In another interview, she said, "My only memories of him are such loving ones. I cannot see him any other way." She did admit, though, Goring did have one problem, and that was loyalty to Hitler. He had sworn personal fealty to him and would never abandon it, even when Hitler had gone too far. The things that happened to the Jews were horrible, but quite separate from my father. Edda Goering was also upset about something else. Her father's lavish lifestyle was well known. He accumulated a vast collection of stolen jewellery, furniture and art during the war. The German government seized most of his collection, but Edda Goering said it belonged to her and her mother. It was all profit for the government, she said. And of course, I did not receive anything. The art thief's great niece, Bettina Goering, isn't as blinkered or as deluded. In an interview with the Atlantic magazine published in October 2013, she asked, is somebody ever totally good, bad or good? I hope not. I think certain circumstances happen that might turn somebody into a psychopath. When I see Herman as a family person, I think he's really nice and charming and incredibly caretaking, and it's hard for me to see flaws. But then you see what he does in politics and how he killed people, including his so-called friends. She didn't change her surname. It was never a choice. That's how I choose to deal with conflicts. Bettina's great uncle didn't deal with conflict or anything unpleasant. Richard Lettieri, a psychologist specialising in crime, says that denial is one of the traits of a psychopath. The technical term is emotional detachment, and that includes glibness, superficial charm, pathological lying, cunning, manipulation, lack of guilt, and failure to accept responsibility. Psychopaths may manifest antisocial behaviour, but the core feature is the emotional detachment. It is one of the strongest dispositional factors to predict violence and aggression, including homicide and sadistic behaviour. One afternoon, during the Nuremberg trials, the courtroom was shown a 2.5-hour film. A film about the extermination camps. It showed masses of dead bodies. Those who were alive were barely so, severely emaciated. And there were facts about torture. Hermann Goering turned away or had his head down. He refused to watch. One of the psychologists who spoke to him regularly was Gustav Gilbert, who was Jewish. He talked to Goering after the film was shown. That morning, Goering and other defendants had laughed about Germany's takeover of Austria. The subjugation of another country is what they were laughing about. Goering told Gilbert he was upset because a good day in which everyone was laughing with him over Austria's fall was ruined by those awful films that were propaganda and spoiled everything. Gilbert told Goering the ink blot test he had done revealed a great deal. Goering had tried to lick off the red parts with his finger, as if he could wipe away the blood with a little gesture. Gilbert told him, "You have been doing the same in the trial, taking off your headphones and averting your eyes when the evidence of your guilt becomes too unbearable. And you did the same during the war too, dragging the atrocities from your mind. You didn't have the courage to face it. This is your guilt. You are a moral coward." The detachment and inability to accept responsibility is evident in Goering's closing statement to the Nuremberg Tribunal on the 31st of August 1946. He said, "I especially denounce the terrible mass murders which I cannot understand. I never ordered any killing or tortures where I had the power to prevent such actions." Goering was sentenced to death by hanging, but he had other ideas. The prison commandant, US Colonel Burton Andrus, wanted to keep all his prisoners mentally and physically well for trial and punishment. His star prisoner's influence, his star defendant had a lot of influence over the other defendants, the other Nazis. So Andrus had Goering moved away from them. One of them, Albert Speer, broke ranks and claimed he was involved in plots to assassinate Hitler. Goering tried to instill solidarity among the others. Andrus put Goering in solitary confinement for several days. Goering wasn't only using his charm and influence on his colleagues. He befriended one of the guards, Jack Wheeler, seen here. He was from Texas, and like Goering, he was a hunter. Goering made sure they got on well. Now remember the paraphernalia Goering had when he was arrested. It was quite a treasure trove, and it followed him to Nuremberg. Goering showed Wheelers how generous he was. First, he had a photo taken of him and Wheelers, which Goering signed and wrote, "To the great hunter from Texas." And he gave Wheelers an expensive watch. And the gift giving didn't stop there. After he was sentenced, Wheelers asked Goering if there was anything that he needed. Well, yes, there was. Goering asked for a small briefcase to give his lawyer as a thank you. Inside were white leather gloves he wanted Wheelers to have. And there was a jar of cream that Goering needed for his skin. That day, Wheelers had been appointed property officer. Amazing, isn't it? So fulfilling the request was easy. He didn't have any barrier to getting this. The time of the executions was a secret. Few people knew, as the Commandant Andrews didn't want any of them killing themselves. On the night of Goering's hanging, the 15th of October 1946, a doctor who was also in his thrall visited him. Goering asked him what kind of night it would be. A short one, the doctor replied. Goering went to the skin cream and took out a cyanide tablet. He bit on it and he died 2.5 hours before his scheduled execution. He left a note saying being shot would have been acceptable, but his station was too high to accept hanging. There were millions of victims of Goering's crimes. One of them was the psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, who we mentioned earlier. He had spent a lot of time with Goering. According to the Psychology Today magazine, Kelly was disturbed that there wasn't much difference between his and Goering's psychological test results. He forbade his wife and 3 children from asking about his Nuremberg experiences. He went to a party on New Year's Eve 1958. He was in good spirits and enjoyed himself. On New Year's Day, he picked up his father and they went to Kelly's home to watch the Rose Bowl gridiron game on television. His eldest son, Doug, explained in an interview with Psychology Today what happened. He was cooking dinner. He burned himself and exploded. The next thing we knew, he was on the stairs saying he was going to swallow potassium cyanide and that he'd be dead in 30 seconds. They begged him not to, but he took the pill in front of his family. Goering's life proves the truth of Lord Acton's dictum that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But one of the reasons is the lack of checks and balances on power, a characteristic of dictatorships and countries where democracy is weak. Goering was answerable to Hitler, but there were no checks on Hitler's power. Goering virtually did as he wanted, and as we've seen, the results were horrendous. Now let's finish on a lighter note, sort of. This is a French cartoon published in the 1930s. It mocks Aryans and describes them as blonde like Hitler, slim like Goering, and tall like Goebbels. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my presentation, unless anyone has any questions, comments, queries or criticisms.
Do you know the history of the skull on the hats of the Gestapo blokes wore? And as a public relations exercise, it makes you wonder why they do that.
Look, I'm not sure if Gestapo agents wore them. I think you might be thinking of the SS. So the question was why it was a skull, wasn't it? A skull was on the caps of Gestapo agents, and I was saying I'm not sure that they were worn by Gestapo agents, but they were certainly worn by the SS, and they were designed to instill fear.
It's a public relations exercise.
Oh, terrible.
I wonder why.
Yeah, shocking, yeah. Anybody else? Yes, Doctor.
Going right back to the beginning of your talk, his father, great friend, was a Jew. And he provided a lot of cash for the family.
Yeah.
So how did Goering get his hatred for Jews?
So the question is that early in his life, the questioner was mentioned Effinstein, who was his mother's lover, for whom the family relied for financial support. And the question was, where did Goering get his hatred of Jews? Look, I've read different accounts of that, and that there is a theory that Goering wasn't a vehement anti-Semite, that his anti-Semitism came from political ambition. So he was infatuated, not infatuated by Hitler, but he was taken in by Hitler, and he could see that, that he could get prestige and power, which he wanted, through the Nazi Party. And if it meant being anti-Semitic, well, I'll be anti-Semitic. I'll do whatever it takes, like a lot of politicians, do whatever it takes to get power. Yes.
Yeah,
Oh, Stuart, how are you today?
You mentioned that his first wife had a child. Was it an 8-year-old child, I think you said? What happened to that child?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I think the child lived with them. They lived as a family, but I'm not sure what happened after the war. And I'm actually, when he remarried, I'm not certain that the child lived with them. I'm not sure about that. But he had a daughter with his second wife, as we saw, who's a bit like a father, a bit deluded. Anybody else?
What happened to his morphine addiction? I mean, sounds like it was for decades. In the meantime, Hitler's being shot up with goodness knows what else by his physicians as well.
Well, you had to cope with the horror you were incurring somehow, I guess. Look, I'm not sure. The question was about Goering's morphine addiction that apparently went on for decades. Well, yes, it did. And I don't know, he must have been treated somehow at Nuremberg for withdrawal because, he was still, taking the drug up until the time that he was arrested. Yes?
Goering was also happily into codeine, methamphetamine.
Yeah. The comment was that Goering was also took amphetamines. Yes.
You mentioned Rudolph Diels survived the war, and I don't know. You said he died in 1950s or something.
Yes.
How come he didn't go to Nuremberg? How come he wasn't tried at Nuremberg?
Well, that's a good question, and I think so. The question was, why wasn't Rudolph Diels the head of the first head of the Gestapo? Why wasn't he tried at Nuremberg? I'm not sure of the answer to that. I think it could have been lack of direct evidence, linking him to the things that had happened during the war. I'm not sure what his role was during the war because there was another head of the Gestapo after him. And I think a lot of guilty people got away with it, and it's still happening today. I'm not sure, what's happening with these people in the, health settings who were sexually abusing children right here in this state. Not sure who's being held accountable for that. Not seen much evidence of it so far. Anybody else? Yes.
Goering stepbrothers?
Yeah, he had I'm not sure about the stepbrothers, but he had a younger brother whose name isn't on the tip of my tongue. Albert, yeah. So the question was about Goering's stepbrothers, and I was saying I'm not sure about his relationship with them, but I think he got on quite well with his younger brother. And when Goering got into power, his younger brother actually did some quite good things, helped Jews escape, and was quite anti-Nazi. So it's interesting how you get someone, two people quite close, genetically, who are so far apart.
There was a suggestion that Albert's father was actually Eppenstein.
Oh yes, yes, you're quite right. Yeah, Mark points out that Albert's father, Goering's brother, his father was Eppenstein, the lover of Goering's mother.
Oh, the brother.
So that might explain. Yes.
Interesting, just a comment, you know, how Goering basically surrendered to the Americans. As millions of people tried to get away from the Russians and tried to get across the Elbe so that they didn't end up in whatever the Russians were going to do. And he tried to turn the Americans against the Russians. He was not quite successful.
Yeah, so the comment was that a lot of the Nazis surrendered to the Americans, and I guess you're implying because they thought they'd get better treatment than they would from the Russians. So it was better to, better to surrender to the Americans and not perhaps come into quite as much harm as you might if you surrendered to the Russians. It is astonishing how deluded he was, that he thought that he'd team up with the Americans and that together they'd defeat the Russians. And Himmler, who was a complete horrendous animal as well, a lot worse than Goering, I think, he had the idea that he'd approach the Americans and do the same thing, and that the Allies would thank him for the extermination of the Jews. He actually thought that they would think that was a good thing. Anybody else? We're doing quite well for time.
Neil, was Goering the only one that committed suicide as a result of the trials?
The question was Goering the only one who suicided during the trials? As far as I know, yeah, he was the only Nazi that did.
Yeah.
That got away. But that shows that that tells us a bit about his mind as well, doesn't it? Strategic thinking. Thinking ahead, plants of attack, but knowing that it'd probably be found, and he's the Allies thinking, well, we've got it, we can relax, and and hiding another one in a jar of cream, yeah, incredible.
Okay, I think we're done. Wow. It's incredible, isn't it, that these events, over 80, 90 years ago, and we are still unpacking them today. That is quite incredible. I had no idea about Hermann Goering. We now know a lot more about Hermann Goering, and what an amazing presenter. Neil, on behalf of U3A, thank you. I'm really excited to give you
That's very kind. That's very kind. I will add it to my collection. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening. No, well, they do.